Welcome to the December 2021 edition of the Austin Software Co-operatives Meetup. We are reviewing the Neo-Abolitionism book by David Ellerman. Jeffrey Elkner is running the show this month. And take it away, Jeffrey.
All right, good evening. This was quite a book. I mean, it's not that long, but it's very, very dense, and it was interesting. I had been a philosophy major years ago, and this was like a review of a lot of that too. So, in the concluding chapter, he says that there were really three tasks of the book that he set out to do. The first one was to recover the intellectual history of what he calls democratic classical liberalism, and then to express it clearly in modern terms, and then to show that arguments against contracts for voluntary slavery and coverture marriage based on their alienation of personhood also apply to human rental contracts. And he spends much of the book talking about this idea that wage labor really involves a human rental contract. So the first part, the book is divided into 5 chapters, but it's really 3 parts. And the first part is the case against the human rental contract. And I found, I mean, he goes into, again, quotes Locke and Kant, and I mean, he's going through the whole history of thought about where property rights come from, and the foundation of governance and all of that. But he makes an argument that, and this quote I found to be the quickest way to try to get at the essence of his argument, that it is not possible to alienate your labor. Really, you can't. That as a human being, you are both responsible for and in control of what you do, and it is not even factually possible that you could sell that to somebody else, because they can't control your mind. And he does talk about the possible, I think I have the next slide, about unless there was some sort of implantation in our minds, or we were turned into temporary robots, it's not possible for us to give up control and to sell that control to somebody else. So and then he points out a contradiction that happens in the law, and he does this with slavery, and then he updates it with the rent, what he calls the rental contract as well. Because so in this thought experiment, he says that an employer hires both an employee and a van and uses them to rob a bank, and after being caught, the owner of the van is not held liable because the owner of the van can alienate his van. But the owner of the labor, the employee, is still going to be found guilty by the judge, because it is not factually possible for the employee to sell and give away, alienate his labor. And so he said that this makes this contract factually invalid. So then I mentioned this already, that if we could in some ways be part-time robots, then perhaps, but it's not. The assumption is, certainly the legal assumption, that we are responsible for our actions, and that we therefore cannot give up control of that. So this quote, I mean, this got me. This was new to me. I've struggled through this book, but the idea of what a contract is, I found it really helpful as a member of a co-op to read this. And it says, he's quoting someone, Randy Barnett, says, if rights are enforceable claims to control resources in the world, and contracts are enforceable transfers of these rights, It is reasonable to conclude that a right to control a resource cannot be transferred where the control of the resource itself cannot, in fact, be transferred. So that's stating that same idea again about labor being an inalienable thing. You can't actually transfer. So I liked this image and wanted to include that. So he says there's a contradiction really in the way we treat people. So when they're criminals, we treat them as people. And this happened during slavery also, and he makes a big deal of that as well. So it makes the parallels between if a slave committed a crime, they were held responsible for committing the crime, and yet they were treated as people. They were when they were criminal, but when they were under normal circumstances, they were treated as property. So he says in the same way that employees are treated as a thing in this idea of a hiring their labor, but they're treated as people if they commit a crime. So I mean, this is again another quote that illustrates the same point, that you cannot de facto transfer this control. So interesting, he wants to build a case that all corporations, and this there was a lot of things in here that were a revelation to me. I hadn't thought about them that way. I came into this definitely thinking that treating corporations as people didn't make any sense, and that sort of the whole corporation structure was somehow to blame for things. He takes the opposite position. He says that corporations are just a way for working, for a group of people to protect themselves when they, engage in a joint activity. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little. This quote, he tells the story of what, because he worked for the World Bank, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, he had advocated for the businesses, that formerly state-run businesses, to be turned over to the workers who were working there. But of course, that's not what happened. And he spends some time talking about what the folks at the IMF, the rich people that he talked to during this whole process, pretty much had a pretty low value, a low estimate of the both the intelligence and the ability to plan of workers. But he pointed out that it's actually the corporate structure that can't seem to plan past the next quarter. And then I believe, I didn't include a slide on this, but I believe that he talked about that in Germany, when you have employees on the board, they're the ones who tend to look at the long-term interests of the corporation, because it's their livelihood. It's not just a remote investment for them. And the next section, he talks about the notion of governance. And there's a quote here from Abraham Lincoln: "We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor." And he definitely makes a frontal attack on neoliberalism. And I forget the name, Frank. There's a neoliberal writer.
Knight.
Yeah, Frank Knight, thank you. He spends a lot of time directly addressing him and this idea that liberty, that they claim they're supporting liberty, but they really mean the latter in Lincoln's quote here, that liberty is for them to be able to do what they want with other people's labor. And oh yeah, this is still the same idea. So I'm not going to read this slide right now. But there we go. Okay, so it's not possible to employ another. We're still, I mean, he spent a lot of time talking about this. Well, now we're starting to move into the idea of a democratic firm. So in a democratic firm, the shop floor, office floor member is voluntarily agreeing to decisions to do things made by, decisions made by a manager or whatever. So there's this distinction that he's going to talk about between delegating and alienating. And that this is really important because he would argue that in a democratic run corporation, if it's a large corporation, the owners, which would be the workers, would very likely or very possibly decide that they need to put some people in charge of making overall decisions, but they would be delegating that authority, and the understanding would be that the ultimate responsibility for those decisions rests with the group. But in this human rental firm, workers still have to voluntarily agree to do what they're told. But in this case, it's a non-democratic hierarchy. And then the fiction that they're somehow selling labor power is what is maintained to justify it. So
when you use the word delegate, are you using that in like the wobbly sense of a recallable delegate, someone that's elected by the shop, but then they can be recalled by the shop at any time with a vote?
Well, I don't know about any time, but yes. So when they say delegate, in other words, the understanding is that they serve at the pleasure of the democratic body. Not that they, so it's interesting in reading medieval history, and this book gets into medieval history too. There was that whole discussion about during the French Revolution that was pretty fascinating, about the divine right of kings versus sort of a constitutional monarchy that captures the same debate. So this debate's been going on for a long, long time. In a divine right of kings, the king serves because of God has authorized the king, and it doesn't matter what any people think, or they don't need the people to justify their rule. But in the constitutional monarchy, they serve at the they've been delegated, in a sense, responsibility, and that is the idea of a democratic firm. So the next part, there's the labor theory of property, which was another new thing for me. So he talks about the invisible judge, which is interesting. Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand as somehow guiding the market. But what economists don't tend to do is talk about the juridical reality of ownership of surplus. And so he spends a lot of time. This was tough going for me also, but I think I get the idea that from a juridical point of view, there is only one legal entity, if you will, that is responsible for both the liabilities and the assets of a productive process. And that's usually the corporation, or it could be an individual or a partnership or whatever. But this notion that a lot of economists try to say about each part in the production process getting its own value is just not the way it works in the legal system. So there really is only one entity, and in this case, let's talk about the corporation. The corporation is legally responsible for all the costs of the inputs and is legally entitled to all of its output. And so he's using that idea as an argument that that we should have democratically owned and run corporations. And then he goes into a discussion of what the whole product of the production process is, and Q is the assets, and then there are two liabilities. There are the input liabilities, and then the human labor. And human labor is treated as just another factor of production in the economic sense, but he's already made this whole argument in part one that human labor can't actually be alienated. So you can't really sell it, and it's not just a factor of production. And so the corporation should be democratically run by that L part of this equation. So let's see, prior to the distributive shares metaphor as dogma. So J.S. Mill is another person who gets quoted a lot. The owner of the slave purchases at once the whole of the labor which the man can ever perform. He who pays wages purchases only so much of a man's labor as he can perform in a day or any other stipulated time. Being equally, however, the owner of the labor so purchased as the owner of the slave is that of the slave, the produce, which is the result of the labor combined with his capital, is all equally his own. In the state of society in which we at present exist, it is these circumstances that almost all production is affected. The capitalist is the owner of both instruments of production. So he says that J.S. Mill was aware that, and he quotes him earlier on, that you can't actually alienate your labor. But then he said there's this like blind spot that all economists seem to have where they refuse to follow the implications of that understanding, and they keep maintaining this myth that you can actually sell labor power. Let's see. So our concern here is not the application of the juridical principle to torts or crimes, but to the appropriation of property. So if we're going to be consistent, just as we treat people as people when they commit a crime, we should also treat them as people when they appropriate property. So they should be entitled to the fruits of their labor. And he traces that idea all the way back to Roman times. And he holds that is the case, that we are entitled to the fruits of our labor. And if we're entitled to the fruits of our labor, the only way that can work is for us to be the owners of the corporations that we work for.
One thing you keep saying is that you can't sell your labor, you can't alienate, but we all do. So
yeah, he says we actually don't. He says that's a fiction, it's false. And in other words, and that's why the comparison with if I went back to that thought experiment with the person who rents a van and a driver. So the law does not recognize that the labor, because if that was the case, and I'm the rented driver, and my renter says, go drive to this bank, we're going to rob it, I couldn't be held responsible because I only rented my labor. I'm no longer in control of it. I have alienated it. But the law in that case doesn't recognize that you could alienate your labor. You can't give up control of it factually. He spends a lot of time trying to make that argument, but that's the crux of it, is that you actually can't do that. You might say you're doing it, but you're not. And in the criminal case, the law doesn't recognize your ability to do that. But in the normal case, it does.
So what is my employer buying?
So he claims all the employer is really buying is you're agreeing to do what he says. So there isn't really, I mean, that's basically the factual, because you can't give up control over your ability to to control your body and what it does. So you're just agreeing for a price to do what your employer says. And he makes he talks a lot about how he doesn't use the word dehumanizing, but that slide I showed earlier with things and people. I mean, the idea of employing as if we human beings are just factors of production. He definitely, you get the feel from reading the book, he finds he doesn't like that. And so he compares this rental idea repeatedly to two other things that in the 21st century we have come that once upon a time were considered perfectly not by everybody, but they were considered valid: slavery and coverture marriage. So in both of those situations, slaves or women in a marriage situation gave up their humanity. They no longer were able to, like a woman in a coverture marriage couldn't even sign a document and couldn't have any property other than through her husband. And in this day and age, we would see that as being immoral and not the way that things should be set up. But we still tolerate this idea of being able to rent yourself, and when in fact and then we justify it, like in other words, economists justify it as this equal exchange, that you've given up labor power in exchange for money, but that's not actually what's happening.
So is it that I'm selling compliance?
I guess. I mean, that's it. Yeah, I mean, he definitely says I think there was a slide back. Let me see which one. Oh, yeah. So here, so following decisions to do X made by persons higher up. If you were an owner, you would do that democratically. But in a rental firm, the employee is voluntarily agreeing to follow decisions to do X without any pretension of the higher ups being delegates. They're just, so it's a form of temporary, it's, I don't know, he doesn't use the word slavery because it's time bound, but at work, you're in an authoritarian situation. You're leaving the realm of democracy. And you're doing that for money. You're agreeing to do that. And he's saying that that's all the person can voluntarily do. In other words, you can't actually sell your labor power, but you can volunteer to do what you're told.
Here's some other jump in. There's some kind of underlying arguments he's doing there. So you got de facto and you've got de jure, right? So as it happens in the world and then the law or whatever. And he's saying that you can't really, going back to Aristotle and stuff, Aristotle was saying that there are people who are born to be slaves, he would think. The abolitionists said, no, there aren't. Well, really, even the Stoics are saying, no, they're not. No, there aren't. But the idea is that even at the most basic level, there are no slaves. Even when someone controls or coerces, the mental aspect is not controlled. you cannot de facto be a slave. And then so to I guess this, I'm trying to address what we're saying. You can't really, there are things that are not transferable. One of them is your consciousness and your autonomy. You can't transfer. You do, even when you decide to, I mean, the extreme example, someone points a gun at you and says to do something, you do give, there's some level of deciding to do what they want or whatever. That would be extreme though. So there's like this de facto and de jure side of all of that. Figuring that out.
You know, this has been an important, like even in the Nuremberg trials. So there, you know, there were guards in concentration camps who committed some horrible crimes and then just claimed they were doing what they were told. But the law didn't recognize that got them off the hook. They were still held responsible for what they had done.
Yeah. And to bring that up, you have the famous shock experiments where, you know, we can do those experiments now, but where they would turn up, you know, setting up a room, having someone in there where they have the ability to control a shock that goes, what they think is a shock that goes to someone on the other side of some glass, and they have an authority figure say, okay, you know, which is just a scientist or what have you, okay, go ahead and increase, you know, because they got something wrong, some question, and they would increase it, and then what they found out is that people delegate their responsibility, and everybody thinks that they don't do this, and it ends up being everybody does it, kind of thing. But it was very, very high percentage. When you're in a hierarchy, there's some human component of delegating your responsibility up. You could use that as an argument against hierarchies if you like, but yeah, there's a limit though, like what you're saying. Nuremberg trials, can't be in there laughing and putting people in the gas chamber or whatever. But yeah, there's a limit.
So at this point, this slide, I took a couple of summarizing the juridical one, that we're not really interested in torts or crimes here, but in the appropriation of property. So he's making the point that when people are criminals, they're treated as human beings, and then making the argument that when they appropriate with the appropriation of property, they should be treated as human beings also. That this should be consistent, and it's not consistent with that earlier diagram. You know, when they're criminals, they're treated as people, but when under normal circumstances, they're treated as things. And that's what he's objecting to. So he says it would be a very good idea to have a real private property market economy based on the principle of people legally appropriating the positive and negative fruits of their labor, instead of the property as theft system we have now based on the fraudulent and inherently invalid contract for the renting of human beings. The most basic fact is that only persons and not things can be factually responsible for anything. In any given economic enterprise, the people working in the enterprise, white collar and blue collar, labor as well as management, are factually and jointly responsible for the assets and liabilities created in the activity of the productive enterprise. So he is, his argument here is that we should return to a more original notion of what a corporation is, and they should be owned by the people who are working together through them to do something. So he's a worker co-op guy. And let's see. Yep. So here we are. Let me state most emphatically that what I call the labor theory of right leads to employee ownership, not profit sharing. Profit is, as we have repeatedly noted, a residual. It is systematically unpredictable. It is nevertheless affected by decisions regarding everything from product development to marketing. So if we're going to get the fruits of our labor, we have to be in control of the enterprise that we're working for, democratically. And so he talks about the labor theory of value of Karl Marx being a wrong turn in understanding this early idea of labor theory that developed by Locke, Smith, and Ricardo, and contrasts it with the labor theory of property, which basically is that property is produced through labor. And then their questions comes, who should appropriate the whole product? And he lists three possibilities: the employer, like we have now; labor, which is what he's proposing; and then, or there's also the government and various human rental systems of socialism or communism.
But now the economists will say you don't have to do a whole appropriation. You can do a partial appropriation or a factor productivity. And they'll say that the returns to labor through wages are the factor productivity of labor, which varies the industry.
Right, and he debunks that. So and I can't claim to understand. But he clearly, he knows the math, the Lagrange formulas, and all that. He says that was the part that I was alluding to a little bit earlier, that legally you can't, in order for you to get your labor, the returns of your labor, you actually have to control the whole process. So let me go back to that here. All right. Profit is, as we've repeatedly noted, a residual. So if you're going to be in control of the fruits of your labor, it's not just some small share of profit that you're going to get. You have to be in control of the process, because it's got to it is affected by decisions involving everything from product development to marketing. So we're being hoodwinked, according to him, by what you just said, that they claim that we're getting our just share because they're exchanging our labor. But so that was the point he set out to do at great length, was to show that, number one, it's not possible to actually alienate your labor, and then juridically there is only one entity that's really responsible for both the liabilities and the assets, which is the surplus, the profit. And that has to be, that's the corporation. So if the workers have no democratic voice in the corporation, they're not really appropriating the fruits of their labor. That's the argument he's trying to make. And then, yes, this whole idea, I guess it's a legal thing too, imputation principle. So let me try to grapple with this one. If there are no breaches and no property transfers without consent in the market contractual transfer, then the market mechanism of appropriation imputes legal responsibility in accordance with de facto responsibility. In other words, you are entitled to the profit if you at the same time are responsible for all of the the risk, or that's what they'll argue, is that the capitalist is entitled to profit because they somehow or other took risk, and legally they are entitled. But and then the argument is made, and it's all just and fair because it was all equal exchanges because the workers sold their labor power. And so he starts out saying, no, they didn't.
But this even breaks down in our not even theory, but in current, because all our corporations are limited liability, so they don't take legal responsibility for their liabilities. They only take liability for the capital that they contributed.
Okay. So let's see. I want to skip ahead a little bit because I know, Watson, you have some other things to add after this, right? So I'm looking at the clock. This was
I like what you're doing. Just keep going.
So the last section he talks about, and this, he interweaves these a bit, but he has part 1, part 2, and part 3. And part 3 was about consent-based alienation or delegation, which I alluded to a little bit earlier. Also, it's that the understanding is at the corporation, what we should be doing is delegating, not alienating ourselves. So we may decide we want to have managers manage us, but we're doing that as in a voluntary democratic way. We're delegating. We're not giving up our ownership of the process. And I'll finish with 2 slides. So there's some good quotes at the very end. There's a summary chapter where he kind of reiterates things, but this is the end of chapter 4, where he's really closing out the argument. So I'll just read this one. The justificatory foundation for a liberal social order lies, in my understanding, in the normative premise that individuals are the ultimate sovereigns in matters of social organization, that individuals are the beings who are entitled to choose the organizational institutional structures under which they will live. In accordance with this premise, the legitimacy of social organizational structures is to be judged against the voluntary agreement of those who are to live or are living under the arrangements that are judged. The central premise of individuals as sovereigns does not allow for delegation of decision-making authority to agents, so long as it remains understood that individuals does allow for delegation of decision-making authority to agents, so long as it remains understood that individuals remain as principals. The premise denies legitimacy to all social organizational arrangements that negate the role of individuals as either sovereigns or as principals. And this is a mouthful, but he goes on to talk about something I wasn't even that familiar with, but maybe some of you are. The libertarians have this thing about private cities that, and this goes back into the whole alienating your ability to make decisions again. So there's these cities that they're trying to build that are like, I don't know, I imagine it's some rich person who wants to create a private city. And the idea is that if you decide to live in the city, you move into it, so long as you're able to leave, you give up your rights to decide anything. And that the owner of the city gets to decide all that. And apparently, certainly he wouldn't support that kind of arrangement, but apparently the law doesn't either in the US, at least at present. So he says that contrary to left-wing complaints, the corporation is an important social invention that allows non-rich people to join together and make an investment in a risky venture without jeopardizing their personal assets. And association of citizens allow non-rich people to have an amplified political voice. So he's saying, going from his point of view, attacking that corporate structure is not the solution. The solution is to democratize. Let's see. Okay, yeah, so he talks about the history of the corporation and how it's become a very strange thing. Originally, it was a group of people who came together to do something. It's now become a shell. I mean, it's like you can own stock in a corporation even if you inherited it. You never had anything to do with it at all. Or so it's lost its relationship to people coming together for a purpose. And then right at the last page of chapter 4, he quotes John Dewey: "Democracy is but a name for the fact that human nature is developed only when its elements take part in directing things which are common, things for the sake of which men and women form groups, families, industrial companies, governments, churches, scientific associations, and so on. The principle holds as much of one form of association, say in industry and commerce, as it does in government." So Dewey also thinks that our industry and commerce should be democratic. And then here are the final two things from the right near the end: the human rental relation and the degeneration of membership into ownership. So that was the corporation thing, where seem to have eclipsed the democratic ideal in so many learned thinkers today who would otherwise pledge their undying allegiance to democratic self-governance in the public sphere. Absolutism led to the elimination of the direct market for the involuntary and even voluntary buying and selling of other human beings. Instead, we have today the institution for the voluntary renting of other human beings. And in that turn has allowed the complete corruption and debasement of the original idea of the corporate embodiment for people carrying out certain joint activities. The idea of a corporation is not the problem. The root problem is the institution for employing, hiring, leasing, or renting of human beings, and hence the neo-abolitionist call for the abolition of that human rental institution in favor of all corporations being democratic associations of the people carrying out the activities of the corporation. And so he spent he built up the whole book was geared toward making that assertion. The end. Thought?
Yeah, the whole, well, I had a couple things, but I guess the whole driving home of the idea, I think it was mentioned earlier, but to make sure that we drive that point home, forget about involuntary slavery. Think about voluntary slavery. Indentured servitude, where selling yourself for 7 years. It is illegal. The abolitionists of old made arguments against voluntary slavery. Voluntary slavery, it sounds like a contradiction, but it's that indentured servitude. But you see that time limit, tenure, it doesn't matter when it's 7 years or what have you. It's legally invalid. You can act like you want to be someone's dog, let's say, use the example. You can go bark, you can whatever, but that person that you can write up a contract with them, I'm going to be your dog and you're going to pay me some money. But if they try to enforce it in any way, they try to put you down, whatever it is, the contract's invalid. But that time limit, is the part where you kind of tease out that with, oh, 7 years, it's not valid, it's not enforced. So there's some, I'm going to use the phrase special pleading. There's a logical fallacy going on when we say 7 years is not legally enforced and it's invalid, but 1 hour is valid. That's where it's still slavery, basically. You use the term. Why is it slavery if it's 7 years versus, but not if you consent to 1 hour?
So in the U.S., an at-will state, the contract will state that either party, the employer or the employee, can terminate the contract at will at any time for any reason.
Yeah. So you're not selling an hour. So you're not. There is no way to sell your hours or sell your time or whatever. To go back to our point before, you're not selling your labor. You're selling you're selling being in a hierarchy in the immediate at one point in time. Or
yeah, as best as I can approximate it, you're selling your compliance.
Right.
Yeah, that was it.
But there are limits on that. So, and this is, if you think about a soldier, I guess they don't sell their compliance, but they agree to a term of service. They transfer their compliance.
You're a slave as military, for sure. It's always an exception to the rule.
They transfer their
You'll
compliance.
go to jail if you decide not to do what you
But
tell.
even that compliance has limits. You only have to comply with lawful, technically, in the legal framework, you only have to comply with lawful orders. And the reason that they got reamed on the Nuremberg Prize is because they complied with orders that were not lawful. Even though if they would have refused, they would have been killed. So, there's that, but that's the framework.
Yeah. Good example.
That example of the dog was very interesting too, because so what he wants us to do is treat the facts as the facts, and like libertarians. So he has this ongoing argument with libertarians, and he says it's not impinging on your freedom. You can bark, you can sleep in the doghouse, and nobody will necessarily stop you. But as you pointed out, if you were to put down the dog, then you'd be held responsible. At that point, the dog becomes a person, like he actually is. You can't make a contract to be someone's dog.
Right. And I have to say, I think he has a certain level of respect for the Noziks and those libertarians who outright say, voluntary servitude or indentured servitude, we should allow it. He has a certain amount of respect because they are being consistent. They know that there is no argument there. The economists who are kind of play libertarians, they don't go all the way. They're the ones with the problem because they are like, well, of course, involuntary servitude is, voluntary, servitude. So indentured servitude is wrong, right? So 7 years is wrong, but a few hours is fine or whatever.
Then it becomes a question of at what period of time does selling your compliance become okay? So in the American at-will contract, I mean, technically, you're selling it from moment to moment, because technically speaking, you could say I quit at any time in an American at-will contract. Now, whether you can actually exercise that in practice is another thing, but according to the contract, if it's at will, you can quit at any time. So you're selling your compliance from moment to moment.
Yeah, that part. So you're saying on the economist side, where they are saying you're saying that economists are saying no one is selling their hours. Are you saying that?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I am.
Okay.
So you take the indentured servitude case and you say that you cannot sell your compliance for a block of time of 7 years because you can't be alienated from the decision. If you're in indentured servitude and your owner says murder someone, you cannot comply with that order. So then the question is, if you can't do 7 years, can you have a contract where it's a shorter period of time? And no, you can't, because there's this whole, like, there's the you can only comply with lawful orders sort of block.
Yeah.
So if you shave that off, if you say, okay, let's assume that your owner will only give you lawful orders, is there a period of time where it's okay to sell your compliance for a block, and then a period of time where it's not okay to sell your compliance for a block? Like, could you sign a 7-year indentured servitude contract where you say that you will only, comply with lawful orders?
Well,
I mean, the military does that, so. I mean,
right.
but you give up your rights when you're military.
But the economists the economists want to argue that nobody's being cheated. So I mean,
right.
And so that's really important to him, is that this is a fiction that we workers who go to work for a wage have something that we can sell, and we're receiving fair compensation for it because we could actually sell it. We can't actually sell that, and so now it's at least this brings it out. So all right, if it really is just a contract to do to do what somebody tells me to do for a while, well, what is that worth? And we could have a discussion of that. But what economists, what mainstream economists do is try to make it sound like this whole thing is fair.
Right. There's something I struggle with a lot, is where there's a large group of people, and they could be smart, say economists or whatever, and then your position, like as in my position or someone's position, our position has to be all of them are evil. I struggle with that. Here's, I think, a way out. He talks about it, and I think one of the reviewers of the book is Noam Chomsky, so I can kind of tell where his position will come from. But I think it's leaving things on the table. So he uses the phrase false consciousness a couple times in the book. So when you're talking about your freedoms or your autonomy or what your rights are, your inalienable rights, here's a list of things. So your right to assemble, right? Your free speech right? So think of that as a set, right? You have a set of freedoms, okay? And so false consciousness is, and the way he describes it, it's kind of a, there's just a mistake that's happening, and it's kind of a mass mistake, right? But the mechanism that he's using, if you were to go through the people who write about ideology, so your Karl Marx, but all of the people behind him that expounded on it, then you kind of get a better, I would say, a better account. One account is that there's many ways to talk about it, but one of them is called a totality. So you can have a set of things, and then you have the exception to the rule. And the pattern will be the exception to the rule becomes an argument for, right? Evidence against will become evidence for, okay? So there's two things in the book where he talked about this. One of them is, let's see here. Well, let's, like I was saying, the freedoms, right? So freedom to assemble, freedom to free speech, freedom of religion, and all that, and also freedom to sell yourself into, freedom to sell yourself into slavery, basically. It's a contradiction, it's an exception. So freedom to sell your labor, freedom to sell yourself hourly, freedom, it's not really a freedom. But libertarians want to say you should be allowed to, it's a freedom to do voluntary servitude, indentured servitude, right? That's
actually,
ideology. Go ahead.
so it's actually interesting because you're talking about rights that or freedoms, if you want to use that word, that you can sell versus ones you can't sell. So when you sign an employment contract and you agree to, sell your what is it? What did I say? Sell your compliance, then your freedom of assembly is curtailed. Your freedom of speech is curtailed. As in, you don't really have freedom of speech or freedom of assembly when you are selling when you're on the clock. But you can't transfer away like your right to life. It would be illegal to do so. And with freedom of religion, there are restrictions on employers with respect to how they can infringe on your freedom of religion. So it's just interesting how you're allowed to sell away some rights whole cloth. Others you're only allowed to sell partially, like the freedom of religion, and then others you can't sell at all. So if I sign a contract that you can kill me for $1,000, it would be enforced, and you would go to prison, for murder.
Yeah. So remember, there's de jure and de facto, right? So there's the law, the jurisprudence part, and then there's the ethical part, right? The coming from first principles kind of thing. So the ideas of, like you said, freedom of speech is not something that is part of the law. Recognizes it. It doesn't create it. The argument is that it doesn't create it, coming from the way that he's arguing. But the contradiction, like I'm saying, contradiction is having your limits, which is what you're recognizing. There's that, and they call it a totality in other forms of philosophy. I was going to point one more out, and then I'll stop. Let's see here, because we were talking about Frank Knight. So, let's see here. Oh, okay. This is one where I said within ideology. So again, ideology, study of it, using it as a mechanism to describe social behavior, so that you can point at a group of people like economists, and you don't have to say they're evil, and you don't have to say they're stupid. That's where you're getting into some weird situation where you have to point to a large group of people and say all of them are dumb or all of them are evil. That's what ideology allows you to say. They're trapped in this thing. So with Frank, one of the mechanisms is you'll get evidence against, and it gets transformed into evidence for. So Frank Knight. So let's see here. So this is one thing that kind of bugs me when you hear this argument, but economists say it all the time, and it's popular. So the intuition of slavery is that there was a whole lot of free labor and people made a bunch of money, and it was efficient and all this stuff, right? And the economists kind of have another view, and Frank Knight has his view. So why did slavery get abolished, right? So Frank Knight, I'm going to read some of this. Frank Knight had to find another reason for the abolition of slavery than any rights-based argument, such as the de facto inalienability of personhood. The abolition of slavery or property in human beings rests on the fact that slaves do not work as effectively as free men. And it turns out to be cheaper to pay men for their services and leave their private lives under their own control than it is to maintain them and force them to labor. That is an example. I want to say that's the majority view for economists. I read a couple books. I read one book on slavery and history of slavery and economics, where it was an argument against, like, the United States very much enriched itself with slavery. But for that one book, it seems like there's 5 other ones that are like, no, it was maybe 5% of GDP or something like that.
So are you referring to
and-
The Half Has Never Been Told? That's a
Yeah.
great book.
That's one.
That book is,
Yeah,
but
they
that's,
hate
and that's
that book.
recent and very well researched.
It is, and he's a historian. The economists critique him from the sense of saying he's not an economist. There's a history of economics. There's a whole field of how you do history in economics, and all of them hate that guy. They're like, nope, he's doing back of the napkin economics. He's talking about cotton too much and all of this stuff. So there's counter arguments to what he's saying, but you have to, again, this ideological tool, in order to, I just say, for recognizing when you see this pattern, you see something that it should be, you think it's like, oh my gosh, that is the knockdown argument, it's done. And it becomes argument with that group. Now you know they're trapped in ideology. Frank Knight believes that you could have 100 people and they be slaves. You have the ability to shoot them if you want. And you say, go pick all this cotton. And that is more difficult than managing a bunch of people, and you can't use direct force. That's what they believe, right? So it took something that should be a loss for the position and turned it into a reinforcement for the position. It's one of their arguments that, see, capital is great because this is the way capitalism stopped slavery. You know, that's what they say. So again, I just want to point it out. I want to offer that up as a critique for Ellerman. He doesn't like that type of critique, and Noam Chomsky doesn't like it either. But it's out there. I think he's leaving things on the table by not going down that road with those things. But yeah, that's all I have.